welcome to the debate. The source material we've analyzed this week presents, a deeply paradoxical picture of the African continent. On the one hand, you have this immense strategic progress, things like the new Suez terminals, the El Daba nuclear project in Egypt, and this really focused agricultural success in Uganda. But that's juxtaposed so sharply against a backdrop of escalating political instability, violence, and profound governance shakeups across regions like Sudan and the Sahel.
It really is a critical moment. You have success and systemic failure existing, almost literally side by side. Our analysis, I think, has to determine which of these forces really holds the dominant hand in shaping the continent's security trajectory.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our central question. We're focusing on the core driver of these intensifying security challenges. Are these recent accelerations of conflict and political volatility primarily the result of escalating external geopolitical competition? Is it great power rivalry turning local friction into proxy wars?
Or are these problems fundamentally rooted in inherent governance deficiencies and really complex local dynamics? I'm going to argue that yes, external actors are certainly present, but they only exploit the critical vulnerabilities created by pervasive internal governance failures. That lack of accountability for me is the necessary precondition for crisis.
And I'll present the case that increasingly it is that great power rivalry and the substantial external material investment that comes with it that are the primary drivers and escalators of instability, determining the scale and persistence of conflict today.
Well, let's look at the evidence then.
So my position is this. I would assert that Africa's security environment is now fundamentally shaped, if not completely dictated, by escalating great power rivalry. When we look at Sudan, for instance, how do we explain the conflict's persistence, its sheer brutality? It's through this complex transnational network of support that was exposed by a secret report presented in The Hague.
The visibility of external support is undeniable, I grant you that. But I do worry we might be mistaking acceleration for causation here.
I think it's more than acceleration. The report explicitly names Iran supplying drones and fuel, Turkey providing surveillance technology, and then Eritrea and Djibouti acting as essential logistical corridors. The insight here is that the conflict's endurance is now a function of meticulous transnational supply chain management. This shows that external powers are actively managing conflict sustainability, not just opportunistically reacting to it. This turns what might have been, an internal skirmish into a regional catastrophe fueled by explicit cross-border strategic investment, all aimed at securing gold and regional influence.
I see the force of that, the material support, but you seem to be focusing entirely on conflict while ignoring the capacity building that's being compromised.
Well, I'd argue capacity building is also dictated externally. Consider Russia's strategic depth. The flagship completion of the El Daba nuclear plant in Egypt. We're talking about a massive $25 billion project overseen by Putin and Sisi. That shows a deep, mutually strategic partnership building capacity. And it's not just the big states. Even smaller states like Togo are receiving targeted security and counterterrorism assistance. So this concerted level of geopolitical engagement proves external interests are the primary fuel source and really the strategic determinant for both stability and instability.
That's a compelling argument, I'll admit, especially when you base it on the visibility of external hardware and these huge infrastructure deals. But I contend that external influence, while aggressive, it only thrives because of fundamental institutional fragility. These failures, and they include a pervasive lack of political legitimacy, rampant corruption, the state's inability to manage resource conflicts, they create this deeply unstable and fertile ground for exploitation.
So where do you see that fundamental institutional weakness being the most critical factor?
The critical evidence is in the collapse of domestic accountability. Again, let's use Sudan as the prime example. The UN labels El Fasher a potential crime scene. Yet, the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, the paramilitary group driving so much of the violence, is able to effectively run its propaganda operations globally. We have examples like a UK-based citizen, Abdel-Munim al-Rabia, who used social media platforms to recruit, to glorify mass killings, and disseminate propaganda.
Okay, But an individual's social media posts, however morally reprehensible they are, surely they don't compare to the state-level backing and the supply of advanced weaponry we were just talking about.
But they confirm an internal moral and institutional failure so total that it invites foreign meddling. A truly functioning state does not allow a diaspora activist to coordinate recruitment for systematic violence from abroad and then mobilize them against its own citizens. And beyond that, look at the sheer scale of the governance failures detailed elsewhere. You have Gabon's landmark anti-corruption verdict against Bongo family associates. It revealed damages estimated at 4.9 trillion CFA francs. That's over $7.5 billion. It just shows the state structure is fundamentally compromised, irrespective of any external pressures.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because internal corruption doesn't automatically equal internal conflict drivers.
But corruption creates the policy vacuum. When South Africa's ANC has to initiate strict vetting for mayoral candidates because of chronic internal ethical issues, or when Guinea-Bissau remains inherently weak, suffering repeated coups and having a flourishing cocaine trade despite holding elections, that institutional decay is the structural foundation that external powers exploit. If internal state structures were robust, external interference would simply be ineffective. The internal policy vacuum is the necessary precondition for conflict escalation.
Okay, let's return to the nature of conflict escalation itself, starting again with Sudan. The secret report, I think, shifts the analytical focus entirely from local factionalism to these complex, high-technology external supply chains. The conflict's persistence is a direct function of Iranian drone technology and logistics corridors provided by key regional actors. That requires substantial geopolitical will and active foreign policy intervention by external rivals.
That evidence proves acceleration, yes, but it doesn't address the causation. The fundamental collapse of the state structure predated this sophisticated supply chain. We see the inverse dynamic in Nigeria, where it's the internal chaos that invites external reaction. The U.S. is considering sanctions, maybe even military action, over designating Nigeria as a country of particular concern, the CPC classification, for severe violations of religious freedom.
And that external pressure, the threat of crippling sanctions, based on a highly disputed designation, is profoundly destabilizing in itself. The U.S. is essentially weaponizing its foreign policy power over internal Nigerian affairs, which, to my mind, proves the external actor is the dominant destabilizing variable.
But the U.S. is reacting to an existing, profound, and multifaceted domestic failure that is, frankly, impossible for the international community to ignore. Nigeria's own Minister Maladri, while he disputes the religious classification, he admits the security challenge involves pervasive indigenous issues, banditry, mass kidnappings that generated an estimated $1.55 billion in ransom, and farmer-herder clashes over dwindling resources. This is chaos that is fundamentally indigenous, and it's driven by resource scarcity and weak local governance.
The fact that internal banditry can generate $1.55 billion only reinforces my point that these criminal economies operate within a global financial network. But the point is about pressure. The designation as a CPC is a geopolitical maneuver. It introduces profound instability into the political system, regardless of the indigenous issues. An external power is threatening to disrupt the entire economy based on its own interpretation of internal security challenges. That level of power determines the political outcome.
But the power of that external actor is contingent on the weakness of the state. We have to address why a sovereign nation of 235 million people cannot contain endemic violence, control its internal resources, or manage resource conflicts before we blame foreign powers for merely reacting to the chaos. The internal security vacuum is the magnet for foreign intervention.
Okay. If we agree that external intervention defines conflict persistence and strategic vulnerability, then we have to pivot to the question of sovereignty in these strategic partner states. Let's look at the Sahel.
Absolutely. Togo and Mali are actively seeking Russian security partnerships, and they're framing them as countering neocolonialism. Togo's minister Janasing Bey thanked Russia for helping Sahel countries fight terror. But I have to ask, is this genuine sovereignty, or is it simply a substitution of one external power for another?
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it a little differently.
The material shows Russia's intervention, for example, using the Africa Corps units to break a fuel blockade in Mali, directly addressing a specific economic attack by actors aiming to destabilize the government. For Mali, the alternative, ceding effective sovereignty to terrorist groups or being undermined by former colonial powers, is, well, it's far worse.
But the material also points to a very clear information war, where the geopolitical objective, which is ousting France, often supersedes genuine local stability. When Russia breaks a blockade and simultaneously accuses French and U.S. media of creating fake news, it signals an engagement rooted in geopolitical competition, not altruistic state building. This is classic geopolitical substitution. It's swapping the master, not gaining true agency.
I disagree. That substitution is often strategic. The fact that Egypt, a crucial geopolitical hub, views its massive, complex nuclear project, the Eldabah plant, which will provide decades of energy security, with Russia as a strategic, mutually respectful partnership, shows that these relationships can indeed build state capacity and national sovereignty. It contrasts sharply with the old colonial models. This is about strategic engagement, not dependency.
State power is built on more than infrastructure and security deals, though. It's built on institutional resilience. Does the Russian security agreement help Mali fix its systemic corruption, which is the institutional fragility that invited insecurity in the first place? I doubt it.
It gives the Malian state the breathing room and the security guarantees necessary to begin that internal repair, which they couldn't do while simultaneously fighting externally funded insurgents.
But the price is accepting being a piece on a larger geopolitical chessboard, where the external player's primary goal isn't Mali's governance, but its own global influence.
Let's look at economic success as a measure of genuine internal agency. You rightly pointed to the strategic investments in Egypt, like Maersk, confirming its investment after the port opening, and those targeted interventions that drove Uganda's coffee success, like the state providing free seedlings and encouraging 2 harvest seasons.
Exactly. And those are examples of strong state direction and policy coherence.
And this proves my point, that where strong state direction exists, geopolitical engagement can be constructive and capacity building. State-led development strategically engages with, but it doesn't surrender to external partners.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because even these stable states face immediate accountability tests that threaten their external credibility and expose internal weakness. Look at Tanzania. President Hassan explicitly stated that domestic protests had, quote, tarnished our reputation, making it harder to get foreign loans, and that led directly to a cabinet reshuffle. This underscores that international economic trust is contingent on internal political stability and legitimacy, not just signing a great infrastructure deal.
But that cabinet reshuffle is an example of internal agency. It's the government reacting to political pressure to restore credibility with external financial partners. That shows the state exercising sovereignty.
It demonstrates reactive crisis management, yes, but the core issue of fiscal vulnerability persists. Consider the devastating debt crisis detailed in the material. African nations are now spending over 50% of their budgets on debt service. That is a staggering figure.
And that 50% is money going to external entities, the global financial institutions and new state lenders like China. Doesn't this confirm that the crisis is fundamentally driven by external capital flows and predatory lending practices?
The lending structure is external, yes. But the reason 50% is spent on service is internal fiscal mismanagement and corruption that allowed the debt to balloon and then failed to generate sufficient returns on the borrowed capital. This 50% debt service figure is a moral injury. That money should be building schools and hospitals, not simply covering interest payments on past failures. Experts note this forces governments to default on public services, violating the social contract and causing anger and frustration among citizens, which leads to protests in Kenya, Tanzania, and Cameroon. That failure of the social contract is inherently internal, leading to the instability that external actors then observe and exploit.
So you view the inability to service debt as a domestic governance failure that invites instability rather than the debt itself being a structure of external economic dominance?
I view it as structural decay. The debt is external,
but the susceptibility to that debt and the inability to manage it responsibly, which then results in mass protests and cabinet reshuffles,